You don't have to leave.
No.
We want to get started on time, so we have plenty of time for our presentation and questions. It's warm in here, I'm sorry. We have a little fan, that's it. The windows don't open. Could you hear me without the mic?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna not use the mic.
Can they hear you?
Oh, never mind for that. Okay, technology. So we want plenty of time for our presentation and questions. It's warm in here, sorry. And we do have an overflow room. If more people come, we're gonna direct them over there. It's being live streamed over in the Heritage Room as well. So there's plenty of room. Grab my notes. So, welcome to the League of Women Voters of Marquette County meeting, August meeting. We've got, amazingly, a whole bunch of new members since June, which was our last meeting. I'm just going to call out their names. I don't know if you're all here, but you might stand up if you are. So, Ilona Anderson is just joined today. Mark and Laura Miller. Eleanor Dorenland, Tony Eppensteiner, no? Richard Jamson, Rebecca Johnson Cook, David Arnold, Elizabeth Benz, Ann Constance, Karen Kays, Mary Kay Lehman, Kay Mitchell, Catherine Julio, thank you. Welcome so much. We have at least 126 now.
Oh,
with the two new ones today. Yeah, this is probably the largest number we've had. Thank you all so much. So, do we have any guests here today that are not members? Please stand for a moment. Welcome our guests, please. Thank you for coming. Please talk to any of us about the league as you wish. We have a couple businessy things to do before our presentation. First, we need to approve the agenda for tonight. So could I have a motion to approve the agenda? Joanne? And Pri seconds. Okay. Any discussion about the agenda? Anyone want to add anything? Okay. Yes?
How about the school board election?
We're going to talk about it as a forum.
Okay.
I'll have announcements. Yeah. Okay. Any other addition or discussion about the agenda? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Okay, agenda's approved. We're going to approve the minutes of the annual meeting, June 12th, which you all have received if you're members. So may I have a motion to approve the minutes? Barb and Ruth, second. Thank you. Any discussion or questions about the minutes? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Thank you. I'm going to make some announcements, and you're going to get tired of my voice, but I'm just going to do them. First off, thank you to all the league members who were working the polls for the primary election and working as observing the board of canvassers. Thank you so much for all your work. Yes, please.
We need names to provide to the league, to Michigan.
Okay. If you work the polls, see Pri, give her your name. We've been the voter services, all of us have been very busy. We had Blueberry Fest, where we had 326 children voting for their favorite fish. And at the same time, we were talking to their parents, right? And handing out bookmarks and information. So they voted that the coho salmon was their favorite fish in Michigan. I was pulling for the sturgeon, but we're going to do it again. We're going to have the same Hooked on Voting kind of setup at the Berga Block Party on August 18th from 2 to 5. We have a sign up just outside the doors if you would like to participate in this fun time. It's great fun talking with the kids and with the parents, so please sign up. We also have Fall Fest coming up, which is on the northern campus. This is where we interact especially with new students about all the different organizations in town and on campus, have booths there, and we're there with our therapy dog, and we talked to students about their plans for voting and registration. So you can sign up for that as well. We are going to have an adopt a sign program. We don't have any signs tonight, right, Bree?
No, they're not.
No, they're not yet.
And yeah.
But there will be, keep your eyes open, there'll be vote 411 signs, just like the ones we've had before. So if you have one, you don't have to get a new one. And then we're also going to have thank yous for the poll workers. So you can adopt one of those. So the general election is coming up faster than we think, November 5th. So several announcements. Vote 411 will be going active again mid-September. We need volunteers to help contact candidates. We have a sign up, I think, for them. No? No. See Sandy.
Yeah,
Sandy, stand up for a second. See Sandy, this is a lot of fun. You get to call and talk to candidates and get them to speak or write for the Vote 411. We also will be needing more people to observe the Board of Canvassers following the general election. There'll be times to sign up for that again, and there's training online that we will help you find. But if you're interested, again, let Pri know. We'll put it all on Pri right now, but yeah, it's an interesting thing to do, and it's really helpful. We're trying to cover most of our adjacent counties that are in our district, because there's not leagues in every county. Along that line, we're also just now planning candidate forums again for the fall. One of them will be for the MAP School Board, probably on October 3rd in the community room downstairs here in the library. We're just putting that together. We don't have all the contact information yet for candidates because the clerk doesn't have it all together yet, but we should be getting that in the next week or so. We're also hoping to do another forum, a smaller one, possibly Nagani City, because they're going to have some contested races, possibly one of the other townships. So we will need people who are interested in working with the forums to sign up. Again, we have another sign-up sheet out front. Also, if anyone is interested in being a moderator for a forum, I am happy to coach you and help you and give you some opportunities to work on that. So please see me. We also would like to start getting an idea of what issues and questions we want to be sure we have for the MAPS School Board Forum. So you can even start emailing that to our league email. It doesn't have to be a fully formed question. It could just be an issue that you think should be put for them. So we'll be putting those together. Okay, I think that is all the announcements we planned. Does anyone know of anything else urgent? Cool. One thing that we usually do around this time of year, and this is particularly timely this year, is to review the nonpartisan policy for the league for everyone. So for you here and also those watching and listening. For people who are not board members, it's pretty straightforward. The league supports you in participating fully in partisan activities. You can do anything partisan that you would like, except bring it to a meeting or to a league event. That's the distinction. Okay, so in meetings, in league events, there should be no mention of parties or candidates. That just makes it simple. If you are at another event, a non-league event, but you're wearing your shirt, you are representing the league, and you must be nonpartisan. Very simple rule. Other than that, you can run for office, you can electioneer, you can do whatever you like. Okay? If people know that you're a league person, even without your shirt, you might want to be a little moderate, you know, in public. There is also a recommendation that you do not have both league signs, like the 411 sign, and a partisan candidate sign in the same yard. We don't enforce that, but it is a suggestion from the league this year, simply because of the high tensions. So, something to consider. So you know, for the board members cannot run for office. If they decide they want to, they must resign from the board. And we have to put out a notice to the public that they've resigned. They can serve on any public board or commission or advisory council, but they can't identify themselves as representative of the league when they do that. Pretty straightforward. Spouses and relatives of members can do whatever they want. You are not considered to be equal in restriction to your member spouse. Conveners, the spokesperson, which is Laura, and the voter service coordinator, and any other position that puts you in the public eye for the league frequently. We have some other restrictions. We cannot participate in any electioneering that includes donating, going to campaign events, and actually probably should not put out partisan signs in our yards. We can't serve any position in a political party or caucus, and we cannot take a public position that's contrary to the league position. So this is just going over the high points of it. You've heard this before, but it's a good time to refresh our memories about nonpartisanship. Okay, do we have any comments from members about anything I've said or anything that's on your mind? Oh, it's quite a bunch. Okay. Then I'm going to adjourn the business meeting, and I'm going to turn this over to David to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I'm delighted to introduce tonight our speaker, Mark Brewer, who is one of the most knowledgeable election people in the state of Michigan. To give you just a sense of his background and expertise, I'll mention a little bit of his resume. He graduated with honors from Harvard for his bachelor's, went on to Stanford for his law degree. He then clerked with both a judge for the United States Court of Appeals, Fifth Circuit, as well as a justice for the Michigan Supreme Court. He then went on to work for over a decade at Sachs Waldman, a large law firm down in Detroit and Pontiac. After that, he became the chair of the Democratic Party for over 2 decades. Since then, he's done a tremendous amount of pro bono work for organizations like the ACLU of Michigan and the League of Michigan, which is where I first encountered him. And I just want to say a couple words about where I first encountered him. So in the run-up to the last presidential election in 2020, the state board had been hearing rumors that there might be trouble in Michigan, that bad actors were looking for ways to maybe disrupt the election. And we wanted to get some advice about, well, where are those pressure points? Where could a bad actor cause a problem if they wanted to? And so Mark came to our board and gave us an extremely detailed, extremely interesting, very well studied sort of list of potential problems. Now, I remember after listening to Mark thinking, well, that was very interesting, but who in their right mind would try to do all that? And anybody who was in the mood to do that, how would they know enough to actually pull it off? So I thought, you know, interesting, but really, that's not going to happen. Then I remember after the election, starting election night down in Detroit, and every day for months, waking up to news, both at the state and national level, about the very things that Mark had pointed out. And I was almost in disbelief. And I'll just remind you that this sort of culminated for us in Michigan with the State Board of Canvassers in 2020, where 40,000 people joined the Zoom call, including every news organization in the country, it seemed, certainly the big ones, to find out how they were going to vote. And it came down to the wire, 2-1 with an abstention. So, and then of course things went on from there, as we all know. So things have changed a little bit. We've changed our constitution a little bit since then, so the laws are a little bit different. But we hear once again that there's noise about potential problems in the election coming up this year. And so we thought we'd consult with Mark about what those might be, and he agreed to actually come up and talk to us in person. So we're very grateful. Please give a warm round of applause to Mark. Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. That was a very kind introduction. I hope I do it justice with what we're going to do here tonight. First, a couple of things. Thank you for inviting me. When I got the invitation, it was impossible to resist. I thought, one of my favorite organizations and one of my favorite places in Michigan. When I was party chair, I'm neutral, I was in the UP frequently, and I really love it up here. I haven't been back in years, so you gave me a great excuse to spend a couple days in the Upper Peninsula. So thank you for that. Thank you also for everything that you all do in the league. You are really one of the backbone organizations of our democracy. If you look at other countries, even the ones that think they are democracies, they don't have the kind of civic organizations that we have in this country, and you're one of the leaders in that and a model for what we should be doing. So thank you. I mean, you've done tremendous work over the years, taken on new responsibilities in the last several years, particularly your County Board of Canvassers monitoring program, which is a great service. So I just want to thank you for that, for what you've done and what you're going to do in the next 3 months, and maybe even after that. Apropos of David's comments, we'll see how this all works out. So what I want to do tonight, this PowerPoint is kind of an outline of issues. When I talked to your leadership, they thought that this might be a way to approach this. It's a combination of my experience. I've been involved in virtually everything we're going to talk about. News reports, kind of what's going on out there. But then I want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion, whether we talk about it, whether I present this in the presentation or not. Subject to your leadership's guidance, we'll have a very thorough discussion about these topics or others, if they're on your mind. All right, so what we chose to talk about tonight are issues in the administration of Michigan elections. Very broad topic, but there's lots of things, and these are, when I say issues, these are troublesome issues, these are problematic issues, these are things we need to be concerned about. So just an overview, and some of this may not be news to many of you, but I want to kind of start at a basic level. We have one of the most decentralized election systems in the entire country. That has pluses and it has minuses, as we're going to see tonight. I think on balance, the pluses outweigh the minuses, but it does create a lot of challenges for us here in Michigan, particularly given the changes in our election laws over the last half dozen years. Our Secretary of State is our Chief Elections Officer, and she has supervisory authority over local election officials. But the actual administration of elections is done by our clerks at the city and township level. They're the folks that are on the front lines with their workers actually administering the election system. And it's hundreds of clerks alone, let alone the workers with them. County clerks have an important role. They assist the administration, and they're very much involved in the post-election process with our county boards of canvassers. So that's a very broad overview of the system. I thought that it makes sense to kind of work through this, talk about it, because I think you'll see the context of some of the issues that I'm going to talk about. All right, let's start with local clerks. One of the major issues, and I think unfortunately this may continue to get worse actually, are vacancies, turnover, and the lack of people seeking elections. According to the latest statistics, at least 118 townships this fall have no clerk candidate whatsoever. And clerks perform a lot of important functions, and we're going to focus tonight on elections. That's a serious problem, right? I mean, we have vacancies now, and there's been attrition for a variety of reasons, workload, threats, and intimidation. But when nearly 10% of the townships in the state face the prospect as soon as November, because township officers take office in November, very soon after the election, they're not going to have clerks. And so we're going to have to figure out, and typically under our legal system, those vacancies get filled by appointment. Well, if nobody wants the job, appointments may not work either. So this is a real serious problem because these local clerks, they're the cornerstone of the administration of the election system for their township and the voters in their township. So I don't have a solution for you tonight, but this is a problem we very much kind of focus on in terms of how we're going to run elections in this state when 10% of our townships don't have a chief election official. It's a real serious problem. Apart from whatever controversies may be occurring, obviously clerks have a lot of other responsibilities. There will be elections, obviously, between now and the next big one in 4 years, the next big presidential election. So this is, again, a real serious problem. In terms of their workload, there's a variety of issues there as well. Particularly since and this started in 2020, but it got much worse for the last several years. Many of our clerks are inundated with frivolous FOIA requests, typically from election deniers. They're looking for something that they can hang their conspiracy theories on. And we have a pretty good Freedom of Information Act in this state. Could be better, but it also can be abused because there are time limits in terms of replying. Some of these requests are incredibly voluminous, and particularly for a small township or a part-time clerk, it can be quite a burden, can take away time from their other work. They face threats, they could get sued if they don't comply with these FOIA requests, but that has been a real burden for them that we need to figure out an answer to. We should have the right to ask for information from our government, but there's got to be a balance here, because effectively what this is doing is taking these clerks away from doing their job, particularly close to election time. People really, it gets worse generally when you get close to election time. We've also had a phenomenon where, and there's increasingly these, quote, databases developed nationally and even in the state, where people go through the voter lists and they claim to find, here's somebody who doesn't live at that address anymore, or they're double registered, or something is wrong with their registration. There may not be any basis for this, and typically there isn't. But then they take a provision of the law and they make mass challenges to hundreds or thousands of voters at once. There is a procedure to challenge an individual voter with appropriate evidence that that person shouldn't be registered anymore. And there's a very high threshold for that because you don't want that abused. But they've turned that into what we call mass challenges. Somebody just sends a computer printout and says, these people don't live there. These people, whatever the allegation may be. And so this has swamped local clerks with this as well. Now the Secretary of State has put out directions and instructions on how to deal with these. Doing it in this fashion, these mass challenges they are illegal because they typically don't even provide enough information you can make a determination. But it's still something that our clerks have to deal with. And invariably they're not legitimate requests, but part of this election denial culture that has come to be developed. This has been part of it as well. Funding. The election system in this state has been revolutionized since 2018. I mean, it's just remarkable. I've been in politics in the state since the 1970s, and our system was stuck, basically. You had to vote on election day. Maybe you could vote absentee under some very limited circumstances, over 65 and so forth. All other states are moving ahead with no reason absentee voting, same-day voter registration, early voting. We were stuck. We were stuck basically in the 1800s in terms of our voting system. And so many of us, and some of you in this room were part of that, decided, we're going to take matters in our own hands. And starting in 2018, we passed 2 massive ballot proposals, which in a couple fell swoops caught the state up, and frankly, we're now one of the leaders around the country. Early voting, same-day registration, all these great voting options that people have now that they're just starting to get used to. And it's been a lot of work, and I'm sympathetic to the clerks because we imposed a lot of work on them. It's a huge adjustment for many of them. Many of them, when they originally elected, this is not what they signed up for. And I'm sympathetic to that. But at the same time, it's not the law of Michigan. It's in the Constitution and has to be done. So in addition to the workload, though, it means we need more funding. It was helpful in 2020 where there's some private funding that flowed into the state. There were threats against that private funding. That's actually now protected in the Constitution as well. We added that to Prop 2 back in 22. But that private funding is not here at the scale that it was. And so I think one of the things we all need to do as citizens is make sure that our elections are adequately funded. It costs money to do 9 days of early voting. It costs money to have same-day registration and so forth. Democracy isn't cheap. I mean, we all think it's worth it, but it's not cheap. And so this is going to be a continuing issue in terms of making sure that our elections are adequately funded, because all these great reforms don't make any difference if they're not available. We don't have enough staff, or whatever the case may be. So funding is going to be an ongoing issue. We also now have some county, city, and township clerks who are actually election deniers. But what's happened here is, the election denial movement really started around 2020, before then, but really blossomed then and continued into 2022. And we, and many, were able to prevent a lot of that obstructionism and so forth, but they've learned how to game the system. So, well, if the clerk's gonna deny my frivolous FOIA request, I'll run for clerk. Or if the clerk is gonna say, the Board of Canvassers needs to certify the election, as they must under the law, I'll get appointed to the Board of Canvassers. And I can say no right there. So we now have, again, county, city, and township clerks who are openly election deniers. They may cooperate with these groups who are seeking this kind of information to try to undermine the system. They may, I don't know if any of you saw the Detroit News article last week. There's a canvasser from Kalamazoo County who openly said, I'm not going to certify the election in November. Despite his oath of office, obedience to the Constitution, his clear legal duty to do so. So, David talked about the kind of thing I predicted a few years ago. This is going to make it much worse. Because we count on our neutral figures, and believe me, I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands of clerks on the state. 99% of them are professionals. They want to do their job without regard to partisanship. But having somebody like this in a key position like clerk can unravel the whole thing in a particular county or city or township if you got somebody like this and they're working with election deniers. So this is a very serious problem. It's the kind of thing I hope the voters will solve, because most of these folks are elected, some are appointed. But we're going to see this in the fall, and it's going to be a real difficult problem to deal with. We have to go to court. There's a variety of things we have to do, but it's a real serious problem, something we didn't have 2 and 4 years ago, but it's a serious problem now. Election deniers have learned how to game the system, how to penetrate the system. I'll talk about some other ways they've done that tonight. So they're inside the system now, and there's going to be problems as a result. Oops, wrong direction. There we go. So let's talk about county boards of canvassers. Michigan's become quite infamous, as David mentioned, and we all know. Just briefly, just to recapitulate, these boards, which used to be so quiet, I remember when I would go to board meetings several years ago, I'd be the only one there. People would say, why are you here? Now, most people know how important they are. Appointed by county commissioners to 4-year terms. They are 4-member bipartisan boards. Their principal function is to canvass the unofficial election results within 14 days of the election and then certify them as official. So the numbers that we see on election night and thereafter are unofficial until this board says they're official on a bipartisan basis. This system started in the 1950s. We had a number of controversial recounts involving Governor Williams at the time, and the system was heavily tilted toward one party at that time. And to the state's credit, they came up with this bipartisan system. where you have to have a bipartisan majority on this board, certify the election results, everybody's watching everybody else. And frankly, I think the system has worked very, very well until recently. Again, these board members, for the most part, take their jobs very seriously. They know they're not there to be partisans. They know they're there to get their job done and make sure that the will of the voters is followed. However, we've now seen some cracks in the system as a result of the stresses of the last several cycles. There are no appointment standards for folks, so if somebody can't be vetted on the fact that, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to promise I'm not going to certify the election, right? There's no training that's required, and these jobs have become, particularly with the changes in the elections over the last several years, there's a lot more work, right? You now have to review the ballots from election day, you have to look at the early voting sites, you have to look at the absentee boards and how they've done their job, and it's gotten, there's a lot more work involved, but there's no training for these folks in terms of what this job involves. Now, some of the county clerks do that, but there's no uniformity throughout the state, and I think that's something we can use. A real problem is it's not clear if they can be removed or by whom, if they violate their duties. Now, if they violate their duties, there are a couple of options. If it's the certification process, the state board of canvassers can come in and take over, basically. But if you think about it, that's a logistical problem too. There's 83 counties, and the state board of canvassers and the secretary of state staff is very small. And so if that happens on any kind of scale, it's a problem in terms of getting things certified. And the post-election calendar is very tight, particularly in an election year. It's got to run like clockwork. The county's got to certify, the state board's got to certify, so the presidential electors can meet by a date certain in December. And you throw sand in the gears by not certifying and forcing the state to spend time and resources taking over for that county, it can quickly grind to a halt. I will tell you, this was my fear back in 2020. Wayne County came perilously close, as we all probably remember, and I get goosebumps even talking about it, to not certify, right? I don't know how many were watching, you certainly all heard about it, that early in the evening, the board deadlocked. And it wasn't clear that they were going to certify the county. If that had happened, other counties, I think, would have gone, if Wayne County can do it, why can't we? And it would have spread, not just probably in Michigan, but throughout the country. And that would have caused chaos, would have been prescription for the election deniers and the conspiracy theorists to say, the election wasn't fair, they can't even certify it. It would have been a real problem. Thankfully, that did not occur. But there are a couple of other counties back in 2020 where it nearly occurred. Thankfully, it didn't. But as I mentioned earlier, we now have election deniers in the system. And there could be several counties this fall which the boards refuse to certify. But at that point, the state could step in. The other option is going to court. The law is crystal clear. These boards have to certify. They have to go through the process. They have to check all the paperwork. That's basically what they do. They check the paperwork, they check the math, and so forth, but they have to certify. But even going to court takes time and slows things down, right? So there's no good, real remedy for this problem here. Removal would be one, but it's not clear how that happens. There was an incident in Oceana County a couple years ago where the county clerk removed somebody who refused to certify an election. That was eventually upheld in court. That's a brave county clerk who would do something like that, but she took her responsibilities very seriously and said, this person is not doing their job, they're out. But even that is a prescription for chaos and confusion. So we need to figure out some way, I think, frankly, to remove folks. Now, don't get me wrong, this actually happened in the Upper Peninsula. You may remember earlier this summer, or this month, in Delta County, where a couple of the canvassers refused to certify. And they got a very stern letter from the state saying you can't, you have to certify. We'll step in if we have to, but also reminding them of a couple critical things. One, it's a criminal offense for them not to certify, not to do their duty. And two, if they got sued, the county has no obligation to spend county money defending them. They're on their own. Oh, I think that got their attention. What ended up happening there was those canvassers eventually resigned. But that doesn't mean there won't be other people step up, right? Because if the election deniers control one of the local parties, say, fine, get rid of that election denier, here's another one, right? And so the problem continues. So we need to figure out some way to deal with this problem. Unfortunately, and this happens in most countries as well as ours, it may take a crisis to force a solution to this, and that crisis may happen as soon as this fall, right? If we get boards who refuse to certify, and we have this kind of chaos, I hope there'll be some kind of legislative or constitutional solution in the near future. Again, this system has worked great since the 50s. Terrific system. And I think it basically should continue. But we've got to deal with people who refuse to do their jobs and don't take their oath to the Constitution seriously. All right, election inspectors, another important aspect of the system. These wonderful people, some of you are probably part of that group or have been, who actually run the polling places, tabulate the early and absentee ballots, report on official results. And again, there's bipartisanship required here, but again, in my experience, 99% of these folks are responsible, professional, and they do this job without regard to partisanship, which is what the voters expect. But we are developing some real problem issues here. The harassment and frankly the low pay for these jobs. We've lost a lot of election inspectors and it's hard to recruit new ones. Many of you probably saw, I was actually there, what happened at the TCF Center the day after the election in 2020. The banging on the windows and basically riot was occurring in the hallway outside. Why would an election worker want to work under those conditions? Or put up with people coming into their polling place, you know, making frivolous challenges or otherwise making their job difficult. You know, just a real lack of respect for what is a very difficult job on a very long election day. So as with the clerks that I mentioned earlier, we have a shortage now, and I think to make it worse, of these fundamental election workers that you just can't run elections without. We need to make sure that we can maintain the balance of Democrats and Republicans. This is not a new problem, but around the state, obviously some areas are more Democratic and other areas are more Republican. But there is a requirement of some balance. There's supposed to be at least one person of each party in that polling place. And the purpose of that is, again, people keep their eyes on each other, right? And that system has worked well, but it's something we gotta pay attention to. But now, frankly, we also have a problem of misbehavior by some of these election inspectors. As I mentioned earlier, election deniers have figured out, oh, I can be the inspector. I can be in there checking voters in. Well, we've had unfortunate incidents. This occurred in Kent County last year, where an election inspector stuck a thumb drive into the poll book, stole the election data. It's like, you know, I don't know, just stunning to me that people would think of doing that. You know, that's not your job, it's not your data, but I said, well, I was gonna double check and make sure there was no problems with the voters and so forth. It's illegal. We've also got now programs in which these infiltrators are being encouraged to, rather than reporting a problem to their boss, the precinct chair, or the clerk, or whatever it may be, call third parties outside the polling place. Say, hey, this is what I think is going on here. Now, that's not the way the system should work. It causes all kinds of problems and so forth. There are systems and ways to deal with those kind of issues. It's not calling third parties outside the polling place. We also have a continuing problem with inadequate training. Photo ID rules are still a real problem in terms of people understanding them. I was telling some folks earlier at dinner, just last week, I had to deal with a township clerk who, when somebody didn't have a photo ID, told them they couldn't vote a regular ballot. That's been the law of Michigan for decades. And this clerk insisted to me on the phone, oh, no, that's not the law. I said, well, it happens to be in the Constitution now. So I think it's a training problem. And so the Smith v. Holton Township case is one that I'm handling on behalf of a voter in Holton Township in Muskegon County in 22, who literally spent the day coming and going from the precinct because her name wasn't on the precinct list. And those workers couldn't figure out that she had a right to register that day. At a minimum, she had a right to vote a provisional ballot, etc. And she had a receipt from when she had registered, but they still would not let her vote. So I regret having to file suits like this, but if that's what it takes, and there's going to be a significant monetary penalty here, along with attorney's fees for that township, if that's what it takes to send a message that people need to know the rules and be adequately trained, that's all I have to do. So we do have some significant issues, maybe some new issues with our election inspectors. God love them and bless them for what they do, but there are some problem inspectors out there. So, polling place challengers, these are the folks that with the proper credential can be in the polling place monitoring the process and make challenges. But again, what we've seen is that election deniers have learned that they can disrupt the system by making frivolous challenges. The law is very clear about what the grounds are for contesting voter eligibility. They're very narrow. So because somebody looks like they're not registered here, that's not grounds to challenge somebody. Or suspicion of one thing or another, that's not grounds. You've got to have proof that somebody is not legitimately registered to vote. But nonetheless, people make these challenges, and one of the consequences of that is the way our laws are written, every challenge has to be recorded. So you end up with one election worker in some of these precincts, all they do on election day is spending their time writing down every frivolous challenge. Instead of processing voters, helping people vote, they're taken away because they gotta deal with these frivolous challenges. That creates lines and discourages voters. I mean, anything that you all are regular voters, any kind of disturbance in a polling place, causes a disturbance, right? People are like, what's going on? Is there some kind of problem? Am I gonna be able to vote today? Do I have to come back? And so the place needs to run smoothly. It needs to be orderly. And this kind of disruptive behavior causes just the opposite. There's actually a big lawsuit in front of the Michigan Supreme Court right now after the Secretary of State attempted to crack down on some of this improper behavior. But of course it got challenged, saying, oh no, people have they're free to do this. And going so far as to argue you can't even kick out disruptive challengers, which I think the law is pretty clear that you can. Once they cross a certain threshold, they can be removed. So this was an issue in 2022, and I think it's going to be an issue again this fall. I think you can see where I'm going here. Virtually at every level in our election system, we've got issues. So outside the polling places, you all probably are familiar that there's the 100-foot buffer zone, within 100 feet of the entrance to the building where the polling place is. There's not supposed to be any election activity, certainly campaign activity and other kinds of activity, to give voters a little bit of a buffer as they go in. But issues are developing out there with voter intimidation, even if they stay outside the 100-foot zone. And this is something we've grappled with, talk about hypotheticals, David. What do we do if 10 people show up with AR-15s and stand outside the 100-foot zone as voters try to go in? Do they have a right to do that? Are those voters intimidated by that? I mean, where's the balance in terms of all of this? And there could be other disruptive activity as well, but guns are one of the things we fear most in terms of their intimidating. With the new innovation of people being use ballot drop boxes, we're seeing so-called monitoring of them. There was an incident recently, I think it was in Livonia, where somebody set up a private camera to so-called monitor the drop box. We've had people sitting in cars all night by the drop box watching. That's obviously to be intimidating and so forth. So we gotta figure that out. Now, the drop boxes have to be monitored. There are legal requirements in terms of the clerks, keeping an eye on them with cameras and everything. But this private monitoring can again be intimidating in terms of, the mere presence of somebody there. So outside the polling place as well. Litigation. So we have lawsuit after lawsuit being filed in Michigan and elsewhere, challenging the accuracy of our voter rolls. And what happens here is the moment a lawsuit gets dismissed because it's demonstrated that the state and the local clerks do a pretty good job of keeping, an 8 million person list pretty accurate. There's another lawsuit filed. I'll get to, I think, why this is going on in a moment. I mentioned the Challenger conduct a moment ago, the lawsuit that's pending in the Michigan Supreme Court over that. We've had frivolous recount requests after the 2022 election. There were recount requests made about the 2 ballot proposals, 2 and 3. They didn't even challenge votes to change the results. The whole purpose was to get these recounts going, and in the end, they're run by the local county boards. And then to try to persuade those local boards that there was some reason to launch an investigation, that there was some kind of fraud or something going on. That's not the purpose of a recount. But it costs an enormous amount of time and money and stress on the system to deal with these frivolous recount requests. Frankly, in my view, all these are designed to create doubt about the integrity of the system. Because now what we see is, well, the Secretary of State is subject to 10 lawsuits. There must be something wrong. Regardless of the fact that those 10 lawsuits are all frivolous, the mere fact that they've been brought is somehow proof that there's some kind of problem. So it's all contributing to this climate that you can't trust the election system. Because we're suing the Secretary of State, we're suing the local clerks because they won't process our mass FOIA requests, et cetera, et cetera. All trying to create doubt in the system. We have a growing problem with disinformation and misinformation about the system. We've had this in the past, and one of the first things that I did when I started doing this work back in the 80s, that, we would have people trying to mislead people about voting dates. Democrats vote on this day, Republicans vote on this day. Misinformation about locations and eligibility, try to scare people away from voting. But it's gotten much, much easier now with the availability of social media, and harder to stop, frankly. It's millions of pieces of information, a phone call, an email can go out, and you can't stop it. And then trying to undo the damage afterwards is almost impossible. We continue to see threats about the consequences of voting. Oh, did you know if you vote, the government's gonna get your name, they're gonna collect your child support, they're gonna enforce that back warrant, or whatever it is, to scare folks. We had a case in the Michigan Supreme Court recently involving a targeted effort, massive numbers of robocalls made to African American voters, basically telling them about the false but dire consequences of voting. They were prosecuted, and the Michigan Supreme Court upheld that prosecution, thankfully, because it gives us at least a tool. But again, it's after the fact. It's after all these voters receive this information. And these folks are hard to track down, right? They don't register as a committee. They make these millions of calls or emails, and then they disappear into the ether. So trying to enforce it after the fact is a real problem. But again, all intended to discourage voter turnout. And it can be very effective. The disinformation and the misinformation that's out there is just overwhelming for folks. This is going to continue to be, and I think get worse as a problem. I'm just going to leave this here. I had the privilege of addressing your state convention last summer, and I really appreciated that. We've had a great working relationship with the league for many years. I've done a lot of litigation and projects with you all. And I was really flattered when your state leadership invited me to come and talk about election issues. But during the Q&A afterwards, the president of the National League was there, and she stood up and said, Mark, what's the one thing you worry about most of all the stuff you talked about? Violence. That's, and I get goosebumps even mentioning that. I mean, I am just so fearful, given what we've seen, you know, people increasingly rhetorically saying, if we don't like the election results, we can resort to violence. It's become increasingly accepted rhetorically, and this is a step, right? First you think it, and you say it, and then you give yourself permission to do it. So I'm very concerned about that. In the run-up to the election, on the election, and after the election. And I think what we saw back in 2021 was just a precursor to what may happen if the election results don't go the way that people expect them to. Sorry for this, such a downer. But these are the issues that we are confronted here in Michigan. So I'm not going to handle questions. I can call on people. Would you?
Well, I'll help you with that.
Yeah.
We have Ruth. Why don't you go?
So I just wanted to say in terms of the violence and some of the issues that you brought up, for the first time ever, I'm a poll worker in Chocolate Township, and we had our safety training, which included active shooter. It included sheltering in place due to violent weather, unpredictable weather, and illness at the polls. But very clearly, at this primary election, we had police presence. And I'm not mentioning any names, but some of the people that were present there, that were trying, that were just an extra set of hands, said, we got weird people out here in Chocolate. I just thought, oh, thank you for that. Great, I'm here until 10 p.m.,
A couple responses. First, I'm glad they did that.
They
That's
did, it was
terrific.
a great
But you
training.
think of the consequences. They have a police officer at a polling
Yeah.
place,
All day.
particularly in many communities in this state,
It's not a big
is
deal.
not welcoming. That's what they used to do in the South for 100 years during Jim Crow. It was a voter intimidation tactic. But also think of the consequences of this. We now have a lot of schools and other buildings that say, we don't want a polling place here because of the risk of violence, right? We gotta protect our kids. You find another place to do the voting. And so the disruptions that these threats make ripple through the system. Make it hard to find polling places, make it hard to find workers. It has a lot of detrimental effects.
So they canceled the daycare in preschool at the church where we hold our elections out in Chocolate for that very reason. It was just, they don't want the young people.
Now, I remember when I was in
And
school,
it's sad.
Yeah.
It's just
and
terribly
there were
sad.
polling places at our school, and the teachers would take us in and say, see, this is how democracy works.
Yeah.
Can't do that anymore, it's too dangerous.
Is that?
Is there any reason why they can't count the mail-in ballots earlier? Like
I'm sorry, can't count.
the mail-in ballots earlier?
Ah.
They do.
Yes.
They do now?
Yes, they can now.
Oh, they can.
That law's been changed, they can start to count up to 6 days in advance. And so on election night, if they do it right, those results should be available as early as, if not earlier than, what comes out of the precincts.
So when did that change?
The law went into effect this year
This-
for these elections.
Okay.
You can also tabulate your mail-in, your AV ballot during early election voting.
Right.
What we do is we just convert that number on your ballot from an AV ballot to an EV or election day, early voting
Right.
number. And so 9 days before the election, you can bring that ballot in and tabulate it.
This has been a big problem in terms of, we've always alleged, Detroit, we know the count's taking several days because there's stuff in the ballot boxes down there. I was talking to one of the leaders in the Detroit election department, and he said if they get this right, and I think they will for November, they're gonna report their entire absentee vote election night, even before some of the precincts come in.
We had a question here.
I was hoping that there was some legislation that protects election workers and also bans the presence of guns in polling places that would hold down.
Yeah, there is the former, You know, there are now stiffer penalties for that, but again, a lot of that's after the fact, right? If you felt intimidated or you were threatened in the polling place, the fact that that person can be prosecuted later, not much comfort, but there is that in place. In terms of the gun issue, that's a really tough one, and there's a contested authority there. I think our secretary said, I think she believes she's got the authority to do something about that, but if she tries, there'll be a lawsuit saying, nope, it violates my Second Amendment rights. So that is unresolved.
Richard?
Yeah, I got a question. So something from the 2020 election, I hear from a lot of folks that I would call don't trust the election process. Is that maybe they requested their absentee ballots and then they got also their kids' absentee ballots as well, though their kids didn't live in the state. And so how can you regain that trust with folks that don't trust the absentee? Is there a way to?
Right. But I've seen, unless they are hardcore deniers and they're just not going to be persuaded, is that it has worked to ask those folks, well, be an election inspector. Serve on the board of canvassers. I've talked to some board members around the state who said, yeah, Mark, we had an election denier, or at least somebody that looks like they might have been going down that path. And once they saw what we did and it was explained to them, they were able to back away. So it's education. It doesn't work for everybody, and not everybody can follow that path. But that's one thing that has worked. It's a case-by-case basis in terms of that person. But particularly with somebody who's in a leadership position, right? If they're a leader of a local party organization, they're an election denier, maybe it's worth putting them on the board of canvassers or asking them to be an election inspector so they can see inside the system how well it works.
Yes, with the early voting and open up absentee voting, doesn't that make it a little easier at the polls? They're dealing with less people, less votes, so it would make it a bit easier for the folks who are dealing at the
I think that's possible. I think what's going to happen here is, because these changes have occurred so recently, early voting, first time we did it, it was in February, right? It's going to take a few election cycles for people to settle into a new pattern, right? Am I going to vote absentee? Am I going to vote early? Am I still going to go to the polls? And so we're going to see new patterns, but I think on balance, you're probably right. At the election day, turnout will drop. It should make it less stressful for those folks, while other people realize, gee, I can vote early, I can vote absentee. That's what's happened in other states.
Yeah.
But it's going to take some time. We still have to be staffed up in the polling place on election day for the turnout.
Legal question, but if you had a board of canvassers where somebody was refusing to certify, do you have to go to the local county judge, or can you go directly up to the Supreme Court to get
It'd be the local circuit court.
yeah. Okay, so it has to work.
Right, work its way up. And again, the state would step in too, if there are state elections involved. And go to court would be a backup, plus the other penalties that have been mentioned.
So like if the state went to 100% absentee, like some states do, wouldn't that naturally take care of a lot of the problems? And I think the states considered that, or where do we stand on that, I guess?
Right. Well, some states have that. There's really no polling places anymore. Everything is done by absentee or maybe even early voting. But it's also a cultural change, right? I mean, that's a huge cultural change from going to a system where 90% of us voted on election day as recently as 2016 to entirely that. I think we're probably headed that direction, but again, people have to get used to it. They have to get used to the idea, oh, I can vote absentee, right? And it's secure and so forth. So I think we're headed that direction. I hope we are anyway.
Hooey, it's fun to go to the polls.
Yeah.
Come on, you guys, it's fun.
No, you're absolutely right, ma'am. There is a function to that, right? You're participating in the democratic process along with your citizens, and that's not a trivial thing.
Yeah.
We've said here a couple of times that the state board of canvassers can can require the clerks to certify, that's a requirement, but, so what if that clerk really believes that there is fraud? What's their,
Right, so it's the Board of Canvassers that is required to certify. If they think there's fraud, you can send it to law enforcement. You can send it to the local prosecutor. You can send it to the Attorney General. These boards are not set up as investigative bodies to enforce the criminal or other laws. So what should be done is that they should go, again, prosecutor, police, Attorney General. There are mechanisms for that. And that's what the state board does. They've had some real edition scandals the last couple cycles with forgeries. What the state board of canvassers does is, particularly after they don't certify because of forgery, they bundle up that evidence and they send to the Attorney General, who's now prosecuting some of the people who forged signatures in 2022. So it's not that the issue is being ignored, it's just that it's not the function of that board to do that. If they see it, they should report it, but they don't have to and they shouldn't investigate themselves. They're not set up to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and some of the other things, because I see this at the polling place on election day, where I serve, is that a lot of people don't know the difference or don't recognize the difference between an application for an absentee ballot and the actual absentee ballot. And actually, I give our clerk and assistant clerk a lot of kudos for this, because when they can, they insist that these people open the envelope, look at it, and actually read what's inside.
Right.
And that takes care of a lot of issues, but it's part of the culture. They think, oh, well, I got this envelope, looks like it could be a ballot, probably is a ballot on that now, and I'm gonna go in and make a complaint.
Right, and there's so many safeguards when people apply.
Yes.
Your signature is checked on the application, right, before you're issued a ballot, and then when you vote the ballot, send it back, the signature on the outside of the envelope is checked. That's why they're so emphatic about making sure you sign that envelope, because if there's not a signature there or there's not a valid signature there, that vote doesn't count.
Yeah, I like to say that I think that there is an imaginary situation where you could think of a board of canvassers not being able to certify for legitimate reasons. Like, say, all the tapes came back from the machines radically different from the poll books. That would instantly, all four canvassers would say, something's screwed up, and they would then, if they couldn't figure out what was wrong, they would have to go through some process for somebody to figure out what actually went wrong. And that's why it's a good system, is because, it's very unlikely that could happen, but if it did, the Board of Canvassers would catch it.
Yeah, and it's never happened.
It's never happened.
And it's not gonna happen. But there are mechanisms. Look, the canvassers can call the workers in,
Right.
and they often do. Some of you have been canvassers. Brewer, you didn't sign all these things you have to sign on election night. Sign them. If there's a discrepancy between the tape and the poll book or whatever it may be, come tell us why. That there's almost always an innocent human explanation. Somebody forgot to write something down, somebody at the polling place with a ballot that they didn't vote. That happens. So the board does have the ability to make those inquiries and try to resolve that. They do try to so-called balance the precincts, and that's another bugaboo. I didn't talk about it tonight. And we've seen over the years that somehow the fact that the poll book may differ from the tape by 2 or 3, somehow that's indication of fraud. It's not. I've never seen that in all the years I've been doing this. But again, it's been this thing, oh, if they don't balance, there's something wrong. What the law now requires is that the board attempt to do that balancing, but if they can't, they report that precinct. And then the Secretary of State afterwards, they come back and investigate. And if there's a recount, there's gonna be even more thorough investigation about why that precinct can't be recounted. So I didn't get into a lot of that tonight, but there's a lot of built-in backups and redundancies and protections here.
Board of Canvassers can't ask for a recount.
No.
No.
They can, again, apropos of David's question, in some cases, they could retabulate the votes, but that's not a recount. It's not a recount, and that's extremely limited when they can do that. The way this works, the way it should work, the way it's always worked, is certify the election result, and then if you're aggrieved, if you're a candidate or a ballot proposal sponsor and you don't like the results, then you file for your recount. That's not protected in the Constitution. That's one of the other reforms. And we put in here, people have a right to ask for a recount, but you gotta follow the right sequence. You can't do a recount until you have an official election result.
I'm just curious, I have two questions. The vacancies of clerks, is that happening nationwide? Or
You know,
just Michigan?
I don't know, is the honest answer. I suspect it is,
Yeah,
because this phenomenon is not restricted to Michigan.
right, okay. And the second question, nothing really to do with that, but what is your recommendation or thought on funding the election process? Because you said we're having issues with funding, but you never really addressed.
No, I mean, I think, you know, it's gotta be a priority
Yeah,
in our budgets, you know.
yeah.
I mean, some folks have thought about maybe we need to have a designated fund at the state level into which money is put and then dispersed. There's questions of equity too. I mean, local jurisdictions say,
Right,
you know, you impose all these requirements on us,
right.
but the state doesn't help us pay for it. And I don't wanna get in the middle of all that debate, but
Yeah,
there's a question about what's the state's role in funding versus what's the local role.
right.
I just, again, point out the problem. I think there's a lot of solutions in terms of making it work, but we need to go to bat for our clerks and our election workers so they have the resources they need to run the elections.
Right.
Bob first?
Well, Mark, yeah, there is of course, under the new constitutional amendment, the state is required to pay for the monitoring of your absentee ballot system and the right for the voter to monitor their individual ballot, and that's supposed to be paid for by the state, I think.
Right, but in the scheme of things, that's relatively cheap, but you're right, it is mandated.
So you mentioned earlier the notion of private funding of the system. And I'd like to hear you discuss the pluses and minuses and whether or not that's even a good idea.
Right. I think it's gotta be an option, particularly if the public isn't gonna, the public government isn't gonna step up. And the way we worded it in the Constitution, because that's there, it's discretionary. The money doesn't have to be accepted, there'll be complete disclosure of where it came from and what it was used for. No strings attached. I mean, it's gotta be an outright grant for election administration to a particular unit of government. I think it's just gotta be an option until we figure out a way for the public government to step up and fund these things adequately. Frankly, I don't know if it's going on in any great scale, this election. The groups that funded a lot of this in 2022 and 2020 have backed away from it, but it's an option. I'm not crazy about private money funding government, I mean, as a principle, but, you know, elections are important too.
Pay their taxes.
I have a question. When we were talking about the Board of Canvassers and the problems of appointing, of them being appointed and no standards, at what level would you work to change that? Is that state level or is that county level?
I think there can be different approaches. Some counties now vet, the county commission vets people.
Okay.
People have to make an application and they can ask questions about what would you do in this situation? To try to, ferret out kind of their attitudes towards stuff. Because these are discretionary appointments by the county commission. The appointees come from the political parties, but a vetting system I think would be a big help. But then again, that's county by county.
They could set standards and.
Yeah, I mean, I think you gotta be careful about making it too difficult, right? You can't censor people or kind of screen people out. I think there can be and should be some vetting. But if we're gonna do that on a statewide level, that would have to be state law
And training too, could that be a county level?
at both levels.
Mandating.
And there's some counties that do a very good job of that.
Uh-huh.
And others, people show up at the Board of Canvassers meeting after the election and, okay, what do I do now? Bless them for serving, but what do I do now?
With like election workers, how widespread do you believe that like misinformation is like all across the state? How big do you think that is in training?
It's hard to tell because the training of those workers is so disparate. Some places there's very little, some places are great. A lot of times you've got workers who've been there for years, they know the rules, they keep up to date on what's going on. So it's really all over the map. And frankly, if you're an election denier, unless you're pretty dumb, why would you say that publicly? Your goal is to get in there, then cause problems, not admit it publicly. But we're gonna find out. when people try to steal data or make these private phone calls to people outside the polling place and everything else.
That's interesting, because they're training here, at least in Marquette County, for election inspectors is mandated. You have to do it within 2 years. They keep the certificates. It's really detailed training. So that's a county by county decision?
Yeah, I mean, there are some state standards, but
Okay.
I think we need to be much tougher and uniform about that.
Interesting.
Again, when I talked at the beginning, it's a decentralized system,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Pluses and minuses.
Which means we can work locally,
Oh, yeah?
you know, that could have some effect, at least in our county.
I just want to make a quick comment too. I think that there are two kinds of election denialism. One is the very purposeful, we're actually going to try to disrupt the election, we have a plan. But part of their strategy then is to get a bunch of other people stirred up about it. And I don't think that they're quite so committed election deniers. Now, I have found that, just as you had mentioned, if you can get them involved to at least observe an election, observe a board of canvassers, or participate in some way, that it is the quickest cure to that style of denialism. Because I've seen people who said, well, now that I've seen this, I can't imagine, how would you even pull off massive fraud? How would you couldn't do it without getting caught?
There's way too many eyes on the system. It's impossible.
Get them inside.
Other questions? Yes?
Mr. Brewer, nationwide, and the data shows that 67% of people over 18 are actually registered to vote. Okay, so it's pretty low. In Michigan, this is on michigan.gov website, there are currently 8,353,217 registered voters. 351,018 are scheduled to be removed in 2025. 260,000 are scheduled to be removed in 2027. Our current U.S. citizens over the age of 18 in Michigan is 7,910,704. And so that sort of begs the question, why do we have so many more people on QVF that are over 18 that live in the state of Michigan?
Right. So that has to do with federal law. Federal law forbids a voter from being removed from the rolls unless they don't vote in 2 consecutive federal elections.
Right.
So that's how they remain on the list, and that's those 2 lists that you referred to. Those are what we call countdown, that after those elections, those folks are going to be removed unless they show up and vote. But anyone on that list, if they show up and vote, they're on the list. They have to go through the same procedures. They have to sign the application and everything else and verify that they still are an eligible voter.
That still is a huge number of people that are registered to vote.
Right. But we have a very mobile society. People move in and out all the time.
And people are turning 18 every day. I'm sure hundreds of Michiganders do, but it's, you know, like the young man said, people, they get their kids' ballots. And they wonder why. My son moved away a year and a half ago. He's still on the QBL.
Again, if that's the address that they're registered at,
Yeah.
and they're not yet removed from the rolls,
And I said, can I remove him from the voter roll? I can verify he doesn't live here anymore, and I cannot.
you can provide evidence that they don't live here anymore, but you can't yourself do that. Because you think of the abuses that could occur if we allowed that to happen.
Like what?
Yeah, people could vindictively say, I know she doesn't live here anymore, remove her from the polls. Remove her from the
I
rolls.
actually got a letter from Chocolate Township saying, we have received information that you don't live here anymore. Please verify that you
Right.
don't live here anymore. Well, I can't do it, and I'm the person that lives there. I think it's really hard to remove people from the QBF.
Well, again, federal law says it takes those 2 missed federal elections. And that was a reaction to, frankly, excessive removals. And in this state, there was a case in the 1970s that went all the way to the Michigan Supreme Court, or there's a program that they were just purging voters after one election cycle, they didn't show up. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's excessive, that's unconstitutional. People don't have to show up at every election in order to maintain their eligibility. So I think the federal law strikes a good balance. The Secretary of State and the clerks also have other sources. You know, they check death certificates and other kinds of things. And if they've got some evidence, then they send letters like the kind you got. If they had some evidence from some source, valid source, that you may not be a registered voter here anymore, that gives you the opportunity to come in and say, nope, I'm still here. Don't take me off the rolls.
Mark, so after 8 years of not voting, a person can be removed?
Oh, they'd be gone long before 8 years. After 2 federal elections, so that's basically 4 years. Right, because we have federal elections every 2 years.
So they,
Not presidential, federal.
yeah,
Federal.
yeah, so bureaucratically, someone decides you haven't voted in
Well,
4
yeah,
years?
well, the massive statewide voter file records every time you voted.
Right.
And they keep track of that, and that's how they develop the list that she mentioned. These people on what they call countdown, that unless they show up and vote in the next election or the next 2 elections, they're gonna be removed.
Automatic.
Again, they can re-register if they happen to be in the
Right,
state, right?
yeah.
And now have same-day
Right.
registration and so forth, so they can get back on the rolls real quickly if a mistake is made.
So when someone moves and registers to vote at their new address in a different state, is there any kind of interstate communication?
Yeah, there is. It also helps if when that person moves, they cancel their Michigan registration and they cancel their Michigan driver's license. And a lot of times people don't.
Right.
Say, why? There is an interstate system. Not every state participates in it, and it has reliability checks in the system before a state gets told it looks like your voter moved. So you may want to send them a notice. Unfortunately, a lot of these election deniers around the country have pulled their states out of that system. I mean, it's crazy. You know, the system is designed to clean up the voter rolls, but if a state doesn't participate, you can't clean up the voter rolls. So it's really antithetical to the whole purpose.
Any more questions? No? We've exhausted
I
the
have a
topic.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, all of these people, entities, whatever, are filing these claims of election problems and whatever. It, I presume, costs them a lot of money to hire legal term and deal with the legal system. And perhaps after a few instances of that, some of these people will decide that perhaps they shouldn't be doing this sort of thing.
One would hope. A lot of this is being funded by dark money.
Yeah.
We don't know where it's coming from. After the recounts in 22, which I participated in, I filed a campaign finance complaint because we had got some evidence that this Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, and a couple of other folks, they talked to the newspapers or they put a Facebook post up and said, oh, thanks Mike Lindell for giving us $1 million to do the recounts. So we filed complaints. Those are still being processed in terms of saying, you know, you should have filed a committee, you should have disclosed where you got your money. But you gotta have evidence like that in order to make the complaint. Yeah, there's no doubt there's tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars behind these efforts. I mean, they're building these national databases and they say, oh, Brewer, here's the database from Macomb County where you live. Go through it and make challenges. And they built this huge database, you know, encouraging me to go frivolously challenge voters in my county. There's a lot of money involved and almost all of it is secret.
One more comment. One thing is I don't want people to be too discouraged by all this because it is discouraging, right? But there are, I hope and think, more people who believe in this process than want to wreck it. And participation is the key. So, I mean, voting is key. Being a poll worker is key. Being a nonpartisan challenger is key. Being an observer of canvassers is key. And I have found that people far beyond the League of Women Voters are willing to do these things. And I think that we can sort of keep a stiff upper lip and you know, combat this bad behavior. And there's no reason to give up to think that they're going to win. They could win, But I think that the more we do to step up to the challenge, the less likely they will be to succeed.
Yeah, my purpose tonight was not to discourage you and depress you. It was to, here's what we gotta watch out for, right? Don't be surprised and be on the alert if you see this stuff, because this could be what's going on.
The gentleman first.
I'd like to speak positively about the experience of receiving an absentee ballot in the mail and taking it in during the early voting period and actually running it through the tabulator at a time when the poll wasn't crowded, at a time when you're sure that your ballot was counted. And I would say that during this period, when we have all these concerns about bad actors trying to disrupt the process, that we find every opportunity we can to not put pressure on the system ourselves and to make our voting as easy on the system as we can. And I would encourage people in November to do precisely that. Ask for an absentee ballot and to go in and cast it yourself during the early voting period.
And that way you're freed up to work on election day to protect
I was just gonna say that I went as an observer, I suppose it was 4 years ago, and it was the most polite, it was a wonderful experience to see how the canvassers were working together with the county clerk, and they checked on the phone when there was some discrepancy with the voting place, and really it was so polite and well done, and so you should be encouraged that in a lot of places it's working very well. So,
I would piggyback on that, if I can, just to say how many first-time voters came to the polls while I was working this last election, and they were excited. Their moms or their dads were there, and they took their picture outside the polling place. So there is still room for, in-person voting, even though it may be a thing of the past in a few years. But yeah, I mean, it's a great experience, and that's why we do it.
And it feels good.
And it feels good.
Anything else? Yeah,
Thank you.
Well, we actually don't have to zip out of here because it's not quite 8:30, so feel free to socialize a little bit. Our speaker, but you do need to be gone by 8:30. But thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you in September. Don't forget to sign up.
Or sooner, sign up.